They say that President Putin once went into an elementary school and he sits down in front of the children and he says, "Do any of you have any questions for me?" And there was a girl named Sasha. She says, "I have 3 questions for you." He says, "What are they?" "Well, why did you invade Crimea? Why did you support Assad in Syria? And finally, why are you in Ukraine right now?" As she finishes her 3rd question, the bell rings and all the children leave. They come back after recess, and sure enough, President Putin is still there. And he says, "Does anybody else have questions for me?" And a young boy, Boris, says, "I have 4. Why did you invade Crimea? Why do you support Assad? What are you doing in Ukraine? And lastly, what happened to Sasha?" Right? But questions in our tradition are not only tolerated, but celebrated, cherished, and important. And one of the questions that has probably garnered the most attention of all time is the pursuit of happiness. In fact, I believe that the most popular courses ever given at Harvard and Yale University were not finance related, science related, but they were happiness related. The secret to unlocking happiness, how to pursue happiness. And here's the problem with pursuing happiness. There was a famous Chabad Chassid named Rabbi Mendel Futterfass who spent many years in Siberia for the crime of spreading Judaism. And he learned a lot of lessons from his inmates, and he later told over at a Hasidic Farbrengen one of those lessons. One of the ways that the inmates would entertain themselves was through gambling. Now, gambling was contraband, it was illegal in the prison. I think they say the story of 3 clergy in Iran who were on a train and they're gambling, a priest, an imam, and a rabbi, and the Sharia police find out, get word that there's some illegal gambling going on, and they go from cart to cart, and they come to the cart of the clergy, and they turn to the priest, and they say, "Were you gambling?" And he crosses himself, and he swears that he wasn't gambling, and they turn to the imam, "Were you gambling?" And he says, "By the word of Allah, God forbid, I would never gamble." And they turn to the rabbi with a menacing look, "Were you gambling?" The rabbi looks up and he says, "Gambling? With who?" Right? So Rav Mendel shares over that the cards was the hardest part of the gambling because the guard would constantly come in unannounced and they would hide the cards, but he would search every nook and cranny in every corner, and he never found the cards, ever. At one time, Reb Mendel turns to one of the inmates and he says, "Where do you hide the cards? This is a small cell, and the guard searches everywhere." And the inmate tells Reb Mendel, "Can you keep a secret?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "We are professional pickpockets here, the best in Russia. And there's only one place in the world that the guard would never look for the cards: in his own pocket. He comes in, we slip it in, and as he's walking out, we take it out." And that's the problem with pursuing happiness, that it really is something that in our tradition is intrinsic, innate, and inherent. And that's why children are always happy. You know, adults can ask the odd question, "What are you so happy about?" Because there is some distorted notion that naturally our status quo ought not to be happy, but you never see that with children. Their natural status quo is to be happy, but as we grow older, what tends to happen is we endure experiences of shame or guilt or uncomfortability, and what we do is we compartmentalize those experiences and we store them somewhere, we silence them, and that creates a degree of fragmentation. And one of the strongest impediments to sustainable happiness is the inability to feel unified, wholesome, and complete. Now, we all will invariably go through curveballs, moments of lows Ein tzaddik asher lo yachata ba'aretz. Even the Talmud tells us in Tractate Tzvachim that even the greatest of the greats have their moments. Every saint has a past, every sinner has a future. But what do we do with those experiences in order not to fall into the trap of compartmentalization? I want to share with you a tale from the Talmud. The Talmud talks about one of the greatest sages, Rabbi Yochanan, who was a remarkably handsome individual who happened to be bathing one day in the lake. He was spotted from a distance by one of the highwaymen named Reish Lakish, who was a gangster. Now, Reish Lakish was far away from Rabbi Yochanan in that he could not detect that Rabbi Yochanan was a man, and he thought and mistook him to be a woman. But he did see a beautiful countenance, and he jumps into the lake. And he leaps with such strength and vigor that when he ends up landing near Rabbi Yochanan looks up at him and he says, "Your strength would better be suited in the base medrash, in the study hall." And he retorts, "Your beauty would better be suited for a woman." So Rabbi Yochanan tells him, "As it happens, I have a sister who's more beautiful than I. Come to the study hall, learn Torah, and I will give you her hand in marriage." What a brother. And that's what happens. Reish Lakish goes back to the yeshiva, straight from being a robber, a gangster, a violent murderer. And he begins to study. And being that he was a powerful person, talented and competent at whatever he set his mind to, he quickly became the greatest disciple of Rabbi Yochanan, ultimately elevating to the role of colleague of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore many of the laws of the Talmud are debated by Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. They are bar pluktas, they are Talmudic colleagues. But then something really perplexing and inexplicable occurs. One day in the base medrash, in the study hall, they are having a analysis, a lively dialogue about a certain form of metal, a certain material, and trying to understand whether this metal is susceptible to the laws of ritual impurity, which impact only certain materials. And the type of material that they were analyzing was rare, but Rabbi Yochanan turns to Reish Lakish and he says, "Perhaps you can shed light on the status of this metal because as a gangster, you probably encountered this material in some of the weapons that you utilized." Ouch. It's been many years. Reish Lakish is a seasoned rabbi, and Rabbi Yochanan is telling him, "Is this a Glock 21 or 17? You know, is it a semi-automatic? You ought to know." And he feels very, very disheartened, disillusioned. And he somehow interprets in that statement from Rabbi Yochanan, who's his teacher, his brother-in-law, his mentor, he understands in that statement that Rabbi Yochanan was attacking the sincerity of his entire existence in the study hall. That maybe he only came here for Rabbi Yochanan's sister. That he wasn't what he made himself out to be. The story has a very tragic ending. They have a fallout, and Reish Lakish ends up passing away. And Rabbi Yochanan mourns him and never gets over his loss, is never consoled, will never have a colleague of the stature, of the stamina, of the intellectual prowess of Reish Lakish. The question I have for you is, why would Rabbi Yochanan make such a remark? What was the agenda and the intention of that statement? We know we're not allowed to remind somebody of their past if it will cause them shame or embarrassment. There is a Zohar that comments on Avram and Sarah, that when they passed away, the verse, the pasuk, describes them as Baim Bayamim, coming complete with their days. And the Zohar makes the reference that every single day of their life they were proud and they celebrated. And when they came to God, they came with each and every one of those days, not leaving one behind. And here too you have a similar problem. With Avraham, the first trailblazing monotheist, we do know that for a number of years of his life, he was deeply immersed in idolatry, whether it was 3 years old according to some, whether it was 40 years old according to others, or even 49 according to others. But there was a significant period of his life where he was deeply immersed and steeped in the opposite of monotheism. And so when the Zohar says that Avram was proud and celebrated each and every one of the days of his life, and he cherished them, and he owned them, are we even talking about the days of darkness where he was serving idolatry? But there is a beautiful insight here that life is not like a plane or an Uber ride where the agenda is to get from point A to point B. And anything that delays you is a distraction, undesirable and unwanted. But it is rather like a cruise. And try and imagine for a moment if you're on this lovely cruise and you're touring one of those incredible exotic destinations and you get so involved that you're 15 minutes late, but the captain of the ship or your fellow passenger is super stressed because we're going to end up 15 minutes later at the ultimate destination where everybody's parked or where everybody's slated to go home. And you look at this individual and you say, why are you so worried about the destination? This is the destination. The relaxation, the stimulation, the education, what we're doing here right now, this journey is not a means to an end, but is an end unto itself. And therefore, the Zohar says that Avram mastered the art of unifying his entire life story, and he was able to detect, he was able to uncover how the darkness and even those years where he was deeply immersed in idolatry became the catalyst for his further realization, epiphany, paradigm shift of monotheism. And thus he was able to own all of his life experiences and not silence, suppress, or become embarrassed and bifurcate parts of his past. And perhaps that's what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he turned to Reish Lakish. And he said, you are uniquely qualified to tell us the nature of this material, of this metal, of whether it's susceptible to the laws of ritual impurity, not because Rabbi Yochanan was doubting the sincerity of his presence in the base medrash, but because Rabbi Yochanan was insinuating that, Reish Lakish, I know you, and for you there is your current reality and identity, and then there's your past reality and identity that you have buried, that you seek to leave behind. But for you to achieve your optimal health, you have to draw the line. You have to bridge the gap and see how everything in your life is interconnected, and even the dark parts ultimately have redemptive merit because of the storyline and because of where they have led you to. And that is one of the reasons that in the Aron, in the Holy Temple, we not only have the 10 Commandments, but we have the broken tablets. The broken tablets being the reminder of our past. The regret that led us to the tshuva, the sincerity that led us to the spiritual sensitivity and the enlightenment to ultimately be refined and elevated to receive those luchas. Because in our tradition, we have to draw and bridge all those lines in order to see how our entire life story reads as one narrative. Now, I would like to take all of that and as an introduction, look at Yosef's story, which most of you are very familiar with, and share 3 or 4 different insights and commentaries which really form the basis that we treat trauma in today, 2022. So the part 1, Yosef, the apple of his father's eye. His father clearly favors him, in fact makes him a special coat, a tunic, multicolored, to express his preferential incredible love that he has for his child. But Yosef, being young and immature, flaunts his father's love, flaunts the code his father made for him, seems to engage in telling on his brothers, gossiping to his father, and then one day the brothers seek to kill him. They don't end up killing him, they end up selling him as a slave to Egypt. Trauma and betrayal from his own flesh and blood. Part 2 is Yosef's life when he immediately ends up in Egypt. He's bought at the slave market by the advisor to Paro, Potiphar, and being incredibly successful at whatever he sets his mind to. The only person in the entire Torah that we call an ish matzliach, a successful man. In fact, many years ago, I went to visit 40 correctional facilities, and I asked my Rosh Yeshiva, my Rabbi Ezra Shochat, what message should I tell the inmates? And he said, tell them that the only person in the Bible to be called successful is Joseph. And where is he called successful? When he's in prison. It's very easy to be a master of your destiny when you don't have any limitations and restrictions, but try being a master of your destiny when guards are telling you where to be at every minute of the day and you have none of the external trappings of freedom. If you can still be a master of your destiny, that's an ish matzliach. But as a side note, Yosef quickly rises to become Potiphar's chief of staff, and he's living his life. He's enjoying his life. He's combing his hair. But his father is mourning him because the brothers, not wanting to break their father's heart, tell their father that he was eaten by a wild animal. And this causes him to gain the notorious attention of his master's wife, Ashes Potiphar. And she wants to be with him. And she tries day in, day out to gain his attention in subtle and not so subtle ways. Ultimately, Vayavo lases malachte babayis, he comes to the house to do his work that day. That was a day when nobody would be home because there was a ritual at the Nile. Only Ashes Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar, ensured that she would be home. And according to one of the opinions in the Talmud, Joseph was ready to finally give in to her demands, to finally capitulate. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Imagine how lonely he was. In a foreign country, in a foreign land, betrayed by your own brothers, betrayed by your own traditions. Who would be able to withstand that type of a test? But he does. And he runs away from her. She's holding on to his coat. She frames him. She says he tried to hurt her, harm her. He ends up in the dungeon. Without parole, without any rights, and from a natural perspective, he would be there for the rest of his life. Now, the jail time that he spent there was a total of 10 years. In his signature characteristic style, he does not let depression, he does not let morose despondency, hopelessness, helplessness, suicidality get to the better of him. He's optimistic. He's charismatic. They love him. The warden quickly elevates him, gives him a lot of responsibility. And being that he is so empathetic and sensitive to his surroundings, we encounter the breathtaking pasuk in which one morning he looks at two inmates, the butler to Paro and the baker to Paro, who both committed certain offenses, and he says, Madua panechem ro'os hayom, why do you look down today? Which, as the commentaries point out, is a funny question to ask somebody in prison. And they respond and they answer that Yosef was so in tune with the moods of the people that surrounded him that he was able to detect, Hayom, today you look worse than usual. In other words, yes, we're all not in the greatest of spirits languishing in this prison, but Yosef was able to detect that today they looked worse than regular. And that good morning and that inquisitiveness and engagement saved his life, because ultimately, when the butler left prison as a result of Yosef accurately interpreting his dreams. And that butler was witness to Paro being frustrated at his own dreams not having an accurate interpretation and resolution. The butler tells Paro that, I know a dream whisperer. He helped me. Perhaps he'll help you. Paro brings Yosef out of prison, and then the rest is history. The dreams that Yosef did interpret were the famous 7 skinny cows, 7 large cows, 7 skinny stalks, and 7 robust, healthy-looking stalks of wheat. And the prediction was, the interpretation was, that this refers to 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And then Yosef immediately launches into resolution mode, which is problematic, because Paro did not ask him for advice. And to give unsolicited advice to a king in that day and age could have spelled your end, especially when less than 24 hours ago you were an inmate without rights. But Yosef does launch into the solution and tells Paro that if you take from the years of plenty and you store for the years of famine, you will be uniquely positioned not only to survive but to thrive, because the entire world will come knocking at your doorstep and you will be able to sustain the world at great economic benefit. Paro loves it, and he says, not only will I implement it, I will hire you to be my viceroy. And that's how Yosef becomes the most powerful person in that free world of that time, besides for Paro, less than 24 hours after having been an inmate for life. Without getting into all the details, as a result of the hunger, his brothers, his family, have to ask for food, have to beg for food. So they come down, and Yosef engages in orchestrating this elaborate scheme to detect whether his brothers had truly turned over a new leaf and were remorseful and regretful of the terrible deed that they did to him. How? By engineering that one of the brothers would be left behind and seeing whether they would put themselves on the line for their brother. That would be the test. As Maimonides tells us, you want to know what real tshuva is. Real repentance is if the same individual is confronted with the same circumstances and does not sin. That is real tshuva. And that's what Yosef does. The brothers pass the test, and then Yosef reveals himself, and he says, Ani Yosef. And immediately imagine and try and visualize you being one of the brothers, thinking that the worst crime you ever did was forgotten in the ashbins of history, and then waking up to see that not only is it not forgotten, is it alive and well, but the person who you harmed most in this world can kill you at a moment's notice. And not only was there fear at the pragmatic level for their safety, but there was deep shame, guilt, and embarrassment. And as Rashi points out, they instinctively back up, intimidated and embarrassed. But Yosef placates them in a very funny way. He says, I'm Yosef, don't worry, I'm the one who you sold into Egypt. Forgive the spelling, but the next part is Yosef naming his children, and the naming of his children representing very foundational and seminal attitudes which he lived with and he thrived with. So I want to share with you 3 evidence-based schools of thought in contemporary psychology that we utilize and employ constantly in master treatment plans, and hearing them and then going back to the story, we can see how Yosef was really the master of instinctively and naturally tapping into these inner resources to be able to endure and undergo these really deeply traumatic events in his life. Because I would venture to say that most of us in this room, if we were to be sold by our brothers, almost killed by our brothers, framed, left for waste in a dungeon, all of those experiences would really leave us scarred, traumatized. But that's not Yosef's story. So we start off with existentialism. Existentialism taps into the why we exist. Mark Twain famously said that the two most important days of a person's life is the day you were born and the day you figure out why. Because the day you figure out why is the day that you can properly process the indispensable contribution that you're uniquely qualified to bring forth to this world. Now, I mentioned this yesterday. There was a very powerful debate between the early underpinnings of Western civilization and society advocated by Greece and Rome versus the values and ideals of Judaism advocated by Chachmei Yerushalayim. The Greeks and the Romans believed in glory, and they believed that the more glory we bring upon ourselves, the more elevated and exalted we will become, the more valuable and worthy we will become. So the glory that they advocated for expressed itself and was manifest in their architecture, in their worshiping of the body, athletics in the Colosseum, in academic intellectual prowess, the philosophers of Greece. And they were a classist society. Those who had more achievements and accomplishments were deemed to be superior, and their blood was redder. But Chachmei Yerushalayim, on the other hand, did not do away with achievements and accomplishments, but had a very different take on the matter. B'Tselem Elokim Nivra Adam, if we were endowed and created in the divine image, that means that, like Reb Mendel Futerfas learned from those inmates, the cards are in our pocket. Are we tapped in or not, is the question. And therefore, the achievements and the accomplishments are only possible because of that innate glory, not vice versa, that we are glorious because of the achievements and accomplishments. And I want to share with you a magnificent story. There was a fellow in Auschwitz, an older man, who approached one of the younger fellows who had a reputation for having a prodigious memory, a photographic memory. And he tells him, I'm not going to survive, but I do have relatives on the other side of the pond, and it would be the greatest favor you can bestow upon me if you memorize my Swiss bank account information. And if you should ever happen to chance upon any of my relatives and share that with them, you would have done for me eternal kindness. And the fellow with the prodigious memory listens solemnly, and he takes note of the numbers of his name, and he continues on. And sure enough, the older fellow does not survive, and he does survive. One of those crazy stories, fact being stranger than fiction, in the 1970s, he's in London, and he's approached by a meshulach, somebody who's asking for a handout. And he starts to talk to this fellow, and he asks him, what's your name, what's your story? And the name rings a bell, and he starts asking him more questions, and doing a little bit of investigative journalism. And he finds out, after a series of questions, that not only is the fellow in front of him related to that old man in Auschwitz, it's his actual son. And he tells him, you are asking me for $5, for $18, for $100. You're asking me to give you something you don't have, but I want to share with you information that will help you access untold wealth that you never even knew you possessed. When people come to treatment, one of the things we tell them is, you only came here and checked yourself in because you feel like you've hit rock bottom. You feel like your functionality is so crippled that you cannot go on through life. So the example would be, you call the plumber because there's a leak. You break open the ceiling and you discover there's mold. You start to take away more of the ceiling because of how pervasive the mold is, and you uncover that the entire structure is not sound. And you demo the entire house, and then you realize that you were sitting on an oil field. And that's treatment. You came here because of some external precipitating circumstances that you thought wouldn't allow you to continue living your life. But the more we dig and the more we explore, we ultimately uncover and excavate that inner wealth that you never knew you had. And that's existentialism. The second modality that Yosef instinctively and intuitively employed was logotherapy. Logotherapy, or most of us are familiar with, is the brainchild of Viktor Frankl, also a survivor of the Holocaust, inspired by his experiences in the Holocaust, documented so articulately in his magnum opus, Man's Search for Meaning, uncovered a powerful human truth that we are meaning-centered, meaning-making machines, and that is what drives us and that is what fuels us. And ultimately, those who survived, it was because they had a will to live, they had meaning in their life, and that meaning and purpose allowed them to attach themselves to something larger than themselves, so that even when their bodies themselves were malnourished and had every reason to break and to shut down, that attachment to something larger kept them alive, injected them with superhuman Herculean strength. But logotherapy in its broader application is the ability to exhibit resilience in the face of suffering. Because if there's meaning and there's purpose, it helps us deal with the curveballs of life. And even Christopher Hitchens, the 21st century's perhaps most prominent atheist, acknowledged that religion became an incredible psychological crutch in helping people deal with suffering and pain. And last but not least, we have narrative therapy. Narrative therapy gives us the ability to see certain events, but to cherry pick what we like. And narrative therapy can go both ways. We can have a negative confirmation bias, or we can have a positivity bias. But narrative therapy puts us in the driver's seat of how to walk away from that story. And I'll give you a brief anecdote that will really highlight this. Two shoe salesmen come to a town, and they quickly notice that the entire village is barefoot. Shoes have not hit this location. One sends a telegram back to his company, mission aborted, no need for product. And the second one sends a telegram, keep factories running overnight, untapped market, infinite potential. The same story, the same set of circumstances, very different conclusions. That's narrative therapy in a nutshell. I want to tell you a very quick story. Rabbi Baruch Chait, one of the legendary Jewish composers of our time, a great rabbi in Israel, a friend of mine shared with me the story that when his music is his songs are some of the most popular songs, and one of the songs is Kol Ha'olam Kulo Gesher Tzar Ma'od, which is a teaching from Reb Nachman of Breslov, but the tune is a very famous tune. In fact, I believe that the Japanese Olympics used that tune in one of their theme music, and the words are that the entire world is a narrow bridge, but the main thing is not to fear at all. And he shared with me that there was a rabbi who's a local rabbi in Miami who was visiting a town in Europe. I forget which town it was, but it was a town that had a lot of canals. I'm not sure if it was Venice or Amsterdam, with a lot of bridges. And this rabbi, when he went under the bridge, he started to sing at the top of his lungs, Kol Ha'olam Kulo, the entire world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to fear at all. The next day, at the rabbi's hotel, they call him in from the main desk, and they say, there's somebody here to see you. See me? I don't know anybody in this town. He goes there. It's a stranger who he does not know, who he's never met before. And the stranger says, I have to thank you for saving my life. Saving your life? He says, yes. Yesterday, you were on a boat, you were under a bridge, and you sang a song. You sang a song, and I know the meaning of that song. I was on that bridge, ready to jump off that bridge, because life was too difficult for me. But when I heard those words, and those words coming out from under the bridge in this incredibly uplifting, sublime manner, I decided I'm going to give life a second chance, because this must be a calling to me. And I went to every single hotel and asked where there is a religious man. And this was the hotel that said they had that guest. And that's why I'm coming to tell you thank you. But the amazing part of the story is that the fellow heard the voice and he took it as a calling. And that Joseph looked at that breastplate and, not seeing himself, took that as a calling and understood his unique role that he had to play. Fast forward, Yosef interprets the dreams for Paro. And not only does he interpret them, as we mentioned, he provides a solution and gives unsolicited advice. And the Rebbe explains in a Sikha, why did he give that advice? How could he have given that unsolicited advice? And the Rebbe says it wasn't advice, it was actually a part of the interpretation, because what baffled all the Egyptian advisors to Paro was not that 7 skinny cows refers to years of famine and that 7 skinny stalks of grain refers to 7 years of famine. That is self-understood. What baffled all the Khartoumei Mitzrayim, the wise men of Egypt, was how could the years of plenty and how could the years of famine coexist simultaneously? And that's what Yosef told Paro. You want to know how they can exist simultaneously, concurrently? If you take from the years of plenty and you store for the years of famine, you are combining the two and you are seeing salvation embedded in the crisis. And Paro, I want to share with you a beautiful teaching from Rabbi Pam. Paro was able to detect not only the wisdom in Yosef's advice, but the experiential legitimacy in Yosef's advice. And he was able to detect from Yosef that this was not mere academic ideas for Yosef, but that this was something that he lived his own life by. Because if you want to know how Yosef was able to survive the years of betrayal, trauma, and neglect from his brothers, it's because Yosef was able to, in his own years of emotional plenty and abundance, the years that his father imbued him with unconditional love and empowered him with affirmation and validation, he was able to take those years of emotional plenty and store it away for a rainy tomorrow, that even when he would experience and undergo his years of emotional famine, he would have what to survive on. Paro, detecting that this was somebody who lived this advice and not only survived but thrived as a result of this advice, Paro said, I buy in, and I want you to be the architect of that strategy. And so Yosef sees meaning and purpose in his struggle. And Yosef believes in his existential affirmation and validation, regardless of what his external circumstances and conditions might be. And that's why his spirits do not falter. But then he meets his brothers. And his brothers are intimidated and they walk back. And Yosef says, don't walk back. Don't worry. The Sfas Emes, one of the Ger Rebbes, explains that Yosef was telling his brothers, you want to know why you shouldn't worry? Because I don't believe that what you did to me was harmful. I am Yosef, and all the greatness that you see, the fact that I'm a viceroy, the fact that I've saved the world. You want to know how, you want to know why, you want to know what led to my character development from being a young, self-absorbed, narcissistic teenager to being a selfless, empathetic, wise strategist. It was all because you sold me into Egypt. Yosef, like Avraham, was able to take his past and unify all of the stops along the journey and see how one led to the next and became the catalyst and platform for his future growth and self-optimization. And then Yosef names his children. It's not in chronological order, but Yosef names his children Menashe and Ephraim. Menashe means to forget. He wants to forget the pain. He wants to forget all of the betrayal and the trauma, but yet he remembers that it led him to where he is. The ultimate champion of narrative therapy. Taking what's helpful and healthy and leaving behind the toxic and the painful. Contrast that with Esav, Yaakov's brother, who names his estate Seir and his territory Edom. He names his estate Seir after the hairy coat that his brother utilized to trick his father Yitzchak into giving him the brachas. He names his territory Edom red after the red lentils that his brother utilized to steal his firstborn right. Esav, however successful he was in life, surrounded himself with a series of iconic symbols and reminders of the pain, of the betrayal, never allowing himself to move forward, to find closure. Yosef first names his son Menashe, and that's why his second son can be Ephraim, which means to be fruitful and to multiply. I want to conclude with an insight and a story. The Jews sin with the Egel Azav, with the golden calf, and God wants to annihilate them and tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I will build you a new people. You don't need to deal with this rag team. And Moshe tells God, forgive them because they are a stiff-necked people. Am kshei oref. Isn't that exactly the problem? That they're am kshei oref, that they're stiff-necked? Isn't that what Hashem himself tells Moshe in Hashem advocating for their destruction? Why they shouldn't be the chosen people? Because they're stiff-necked? What is Moshe saying? There was a yeshiva student in Israel several years ago who had a terrible, vicious-looking scar in a very overt place on his face. And when it came time for him to date and to get married, it prevented all of the dates from going anywhere. They would look at him and all they could see was the scar. This yeshiva student comes to Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, one of the leading Torah scholars in Israel, who recently passed away, and he says, what do I do? Rabbi Chaim says, you know what you should do? The next time you go on a date, before you talk about anything else, address the elephant in the room and say how you got the scar. He comes home, his mother tells him about another girl that he should be dating, and she says she's a beautiful girl, and his heart sinks because if she's beautiful, she'll never go for him, and he's hoping that his mother's exaggerating. But he comes on the date, and sure enough, she's the way she's described. Taking Rabbi Chaim's advice into account, he says, before we start, I just want to tell you how I got this scar. Many years ago, I was walking home from the study hall, from the base medrash. It was late at night. It was Thursday night. And I see a predator chasing a young girl. And I don't know what came over me, but I started to chase the predator, and I grabbed him. And he took out a knife, and he slashed my face. But being that I was able to hold on to him for a few moments, the young girl got away, and that's the scar that you see. The girl sitting in front of him has a visceral shudder of a reaction. And he looks at her and he says, is everything okay? She says, of course. She says, all the years of my life I've been trying to find my benefactor and savior. I was that girl. They got married, and you know that throughout the rest of their life, and they're probably still alive, whenever she looks at his face and whenever she looks at that scar, what do you think she sees? Not only does she not see ugliness, she sees selfless love, commitment, dedication to helping somebody else out. The ultimate transformation of something ugly to something beautiful, and that's what Moshe tells God. Right now you look at this character trait of being stiff-necked and stubborn as a liability, but it's in fact the greatest asset that Klal Yisrael has, because when they will go through thousands of years of pogroms and persecution, suffering, and every other people would just throw the towel in the bucket and give it all up, they will persevere. they will be there for you. They will always be your people because of this characteristic. And that truly is what Yosef taught us, to take all of the past, all of the flaws, and see how they can not only not be liability, but unharnessed and unleashed to become our ultimate assets in creating a beautiful, cohesive narrative and in elevating all of life's curveballs and traumas to become the best possible people we can become. Thank you very much.
If you like that video, hit the subscribe button and notification bell below for hours of the best Jewish content online.